Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Carefulist, the podcast. I'm your host, Katie Christophic, founder of The Carefulist. Today, we welcome two guests to the show who are clinical psychologists, caregiving experts, authors of multiple titles, and most recently, their book, the AARP Caregiver Answer Book. Welcome to the show, Barry Jacobs and Julie Mayer.
Thank you so much,
Hi.
Katie.
Hi.
So, we'll dive right into caregiving stories and how you got into this space. So, Julie, if you'd like to answer first.
Well, really, our first entry into being caregivers is different from our first entry into the caregiving space because as therapists and writers, we were writing about caregiving, helping caregivers. But then what happened was that my mother was my father's caregiver. She went in to get heart surgery, which was successful, but 3 days later, she passed away from a rare side effect called hemorrhagic pancreatitis. And it left my siblings and I, grieving and trying to figure out how to take care of my dad, who lived several hundred miles away from me, further from one sibling, a little bit closer to another. The closest was 45 minutes away. And so we were sort of scrambling. And that really was our entry into caregiving. We worked it out. I was traveling back and forth every other weekend. My brother did most of the daily caregiving, and I would give him some respite every other weekend. But that is how it all started. And we took care of my dad for about a year and a quarter until he passed away. And then we had a few months off. We didn't know it was just a few months off. We thought, okay, we're good now. It
Yeah.
was really stressful. We had teenagers at home. Nice time, nice break. And then everything started with Barry's parents.
Oh, gosh. So, Barry, if you would share your side of the story with us.
Sure. So before I talk about my mother and stepfather, I'm going to go back a lot further to talk about my father, who was diagnosed with brain cancer when I was 14 and was quite ill and died a year later. And uh, that had a major impact on me personally, and on certainly had really tore apart my family in lots of different ways. So I learned at a very early age that these kinds of illnesses don't occur to individuals, they occur to families. And that really led me down a very circuitous path. But eventually, when I became a psychologist, I decided that I wanted to work with uh, individuals dealing with chronic and progressive illnesses and their family members. And kind of long before we took care of Julie's dad, I had written my first book on family caregiving back in 2006. Um, so jumping forward after Julie's father died, my mother and stepfather had been living in South Florida, living in a wonderful gated golf community where my stepfather for years played golf 3 times a week until he developed Alzheimer's dementia. And my mother was caring for him, but my mother was increasingly physically frail. She had very severe back pain, and she also had kidney disease. So my mom really couldn't care for him. I mean,
Yeah.
she could, but she couldn't. He was agitated a lot of the time. And so in 2010, Julie and I moved my mother and stepfather up from South Florida to live in an apartment a mile from our home in suburban Philadelphia. And then we proceeded to care for them for the next 7 years. So, aside from what happened when I was a teenager, between the time Julie was taking care of her father, and then the two of us were taking care of my mother and stepfather, we had about a 9 year stretch of pretty solid caregiving there. And my stepfather eventually died, but then my mother developed dementia, so it went on a long time.
That is so much, and for so long. And I think that's something that people, until they're in it, there's no way for them to understand that sustained care and the toll that it takes. The way you phrase that is so helpful that, it doesn't just happen to the person with the diagnosis. It really does affect the entire family and for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, different diseases have different trajectories, obviously. I mean, we know, for instance, dementia is a very slowly progressing disease, which usually goes on for years. I think the statistic is that on the day that someone is diagnosed with dementia, they're likely to live another 7 to 8 years. And that means their family members are likely to have to care for them for that time. So we're talking about a long stretch. Cancer, brain cancer in particular, people don't live that long. It's usually more of a sprint than a marathon.
Right.
And marathons have challenges, sprints have challenges. Whether you're caregiving for a long time or not, it's still completely disrupts family life and demands a lot of sacrifice.
Yes. Yeah. And those two challenges are unique. Um, from family members' perspective, it's when it happens quickly, you have this sudden jolt and it's very disorienting. And when it's a long process, you have more time to adjust, but it is incremental adjustments and kind of waiting for that next shoe to drop and wondering when that's going to occur.
Yeah, you're constantly adjusting to the changes in the care receiver. And so you're constantly anticipating what's next and stressing out about what you're doing in the moment. So it's tough too.
Yeah. So Julie, I'm curious how you got on the path to becoming a clinical psychologist. What interested you? What drove you to make that choice?
Okay, that's a long time ago. Let's see. My dad was a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and so I kind of grew up with sort of my religion growing up. And then
Mhm.
um, I was interested in writing, and in college I double majored in psychology and in English, and um, it just seemed like the right next step. It did, and I'm not sorry. I've learned a lot. I've talked to a lot of people, and yeah, so I think it was just kind of meant to be for me.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm thinking. It seems like, a certain type of person is drawn to that. And when you hear so many stories from patients and from just general conversation, I would think that has a lot to do with the foundation um, for the caregiving books and things that you've written because you've had so much interaction with so many different people and circumstances.
Absolutely, and even after Barry and I wrote our first book together, we did a lot of public speaking. We did a lot of conferences. It was sort of before podcasts were so big, and but we met so many caregivers, and it was really meaningful. We would give our talk, and then people would line up to get their book signed, and each person had a story, and some of them were tearful. They just, what I learned is that caregivers need to tell their story, and they need people to hear it.
Yeah, that's so true. And Barry, I would love your thoughts on how and why you chose this path. Although as a listener, I'm making some assumptions based on your experience as a young teenager. But, I would love to hear it from your perspective.
Sure, Katie. So I didn't immediately decide I wanted to become a clinical psychologist focusing on family caregivers. I actually, like Julie, wanted to be a world famous writer. And I worked as a journalist in Manhattan for about 5 years, working for different magazines and doing a lot of writing. Was pretty unhappy doing that. It wasn't as fulfilling as I had hoped it would be. And then I thought, well, heck, I could become a clinical psychologist. I could work for 2 or 3 hours a day seeing clients and then write the rest of the time. It would be a piece of cake. Well, of course, that was completely unrealistic. But I started graduate school for clinical psychology. Found it to be very different than what I had thought it was going to be, but also fascinating. And then in the third year of my 5 year program, worked as a on a physical medicine rehab unit of a local hospital, and it was there that I first encountered people who had brain injuries and stroke and brain cancer. And I realized that working with them as a clinician uh, really resonated with me personally. And it was from that point on, and that's almost 40 years ago now, that I have decided, what my life mission here is, and that is working as a clinical psychologist, doing, working with caregivers. But like most of us, it took me a while to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, nobody goes into adulthood thinking, hey, I'm going to be a caregiver. I'm going to help caregivers. I was a communications professional working in pharma and biotech. Caregiving was not on my radar. I wanted to be a doctor, but math and science, not so much. But words, yes. So I went the communication route and kind of weaseled my way into working with folks who are in the sciences. And then, of course, caregiving happened to my family, and that's how I got to what I'm doing now. So it's certainly not something most people set out to do with their career. So thank you for sharing that. And the fact that you started out as a writer is interesting because, of course, you have these books, but you also write for AARP. So, for folks who are listening, you may have seen some of Barry's work with AARP. Um, I'm curious if within caregiving you have favorite topic or something that people ask you about a lot that they're looking for more information commonly.
So, in this book that we have, the AARP Caregiver Answer Book, we devote a lot of attention to working with siblings because
Mm,
in our experience, it's one of the most common questions that people ask. The specific question
yeah,
that they commonly ask is, how can I make my brother do more for my mother, for our mother? Because oftentimes in a family with their adult children, with their daughters and sons, the daughters are the ones who do the bulk of the caregiving, and the sons somehow get away scot-free. And there's a lot of resentment about that. So that's a common question that has come up over the years. Uh, Another really is, how people don't want to mess this up. They don't want to. They don't
yeah,
know what they don't know at the beginning, or they realize that they don't know what they don't know at the beginning, and they are afraid they're going to make mistakes, and the mistakes are, in the worst case scenario, going to be fatal to the person they're caring for, and but just cause them harm, and
right.
nobody wants that. So they people just want some guidance as to how to go about this, how to move forward, how to get the lay of the land, and I mean through the Carefulist website, you provide a lot of that information. There are a lot of us here working in the caregiving field that a lot of what we do is just orient people to this new world, this foreign land that they've never been in before. And
Yeah,
because until they feel oriented, they can't really feel like they have a sense of mastery over this. Once oriented and once they gain some skills and they kind of settle into the caregiving role, then they generally feel pretty proud of the things that they're accomplishing. But the early days are often anxiety producing for folks. They don't know what they feel like they should know, and they're really afraid they're going to blow it.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. The fear of the what don't I know and I don't even know what to ask is very real. And one of the themes that I've come across is very similar to what you were just saying. A lot of the folks I talk to worry about not being the perfect caregiver. And I have a lot of conversations with folks about how there's no such thing as perfection in caregiving. I mean, there's no such thing as perfection anywhere, but especially in caregiving because it is such a huge learning curve. Um, and giving yourself grace and being able to move forward from a mistake is really important. So, Julie, I'm curious what advice you might have for folks who are struggling with, I screwed up yesterday and now I'm nervous about today. How can they deal with that and move forward?
Often it's not just nervous about today, it's I feel guilty, I feel ashamed, I don't even want to tell anybody. My loved one will never forgive me. Was I being aggressive? Am I resentful of them? People question themselves in ways that are not that helpful because everybody does make mistakes and it is a huge learning curve. And so, I say to people, well, when you were not a caregiver, when you were just living your life with this person sometimes or not with this person, you made mistakes. Mistakes are normal. And then what do you do after that? You learn from it. You try to take what you can from the bad situation and you move forward. And it doesn't help anybody, not yourself, not your loved one, to ruminate about whatever the mistake was and the impact of it. You move on, fix the problem, figure out how to solve the problem, take up the carpeting if the person is tripping on it or whatever it is that you need to do. And then say to yourself, this is hard. I'm learning. I'm doing the best I can. And I'm sure that's the truth. And that doesn't make me perfect because nothing can make me perfect. There will always be things that go wrong.
Right. And it's so important too to remember that your loved one knows you love them and they know you're trying your best. I mean, sometimes those relationships aren't as easy as that. Um, but that doesn't make it any less true deep down.
Oh, of course, every relationship is complicated. Sometimes, yes, your loved one knows that you love them, but they also can be irritated with you and they can be irritating to you.
Yep.
Another really common thing that people ask us is, I I feel resentful. Like I sometimes wish I weren't having to do it. Like I'd like to get on a plane and fly across the country and get away. Um, and I feel guilty about that. Is that normal? And like, yeah, of course it's normal. Of course it's normal. Even people taking care of little babies feel like I wish I could get away. Everybody, when you feel a little bit trapped, you have a fantasy about getting away. It doesn't mean you're going to do that. And it definitely
Right.
doesn't mean you have to be judged for your thoughts.
Yeah. Oh, I was just thinking that as you were saying it, the first time I got out of the house after my daughter was born, it was a 15-minute trip to the grocery store, but it was the best 15 minutes I'd spent in a really long time. So, I mean, if you are a parent, it's helpful to think of it in that sort of a frame of mind. Like you doesn't mean you don't love your child, it doesn't mean you don't want to spend time with them, but you are a human being and you need a break.
Yeah, we go even further than that, Katie. We tell people very explicitly, you can love your person you're caring for, but you could hate caregiving. You're allowed to hate
Yeah.
caregiving because honestly, the things that people have to do as a caregiver are not generally fun, I mean, so it could be
Right.
anything from drudge work like taking care of their insurance forms or paying their bills, or it could be just messy, nasty work like
Yeah.
toileting them. I mean, there's a range of things which are all fall into the category of unpleasant and not things you would choose to do. And so you can
Right.
hate all those activities. And Julie and I certainly did things for my mother and stepfather in particular that we didn't really like to do, but we did because we thought it was important to do, and it didn't detract from the affection we had for our parents.
I think it's really important that because there is so much drudge work and so many challenges and difficult moments, and you take the pillbox away or you take the car away, like there's so many difficult parts of caregiving that
Yeah.
it's super important that we kind of mindfully make positive interactions.
Yes.
We add in something like watching a comedy together, listening to music together, taking a walk if possible, doing things that lead to more positive feelings. Um, because otherwise, you're just stuck feeling like you have a list of chores that is never ending and keeps growing.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. One of the things that I like to ask folks on this program is what brings you joy? I used to only say humor, and I've learned not everybody finds humor in certain situations. I mean, that's how my sister and I dealt with my mom's diagnosis and our dementia journey. Our family has always dealt with things with humor. And it's why this podcast is called Carefulist the Podcast, because I'm a huge Mel Brooks fan. And it's a shout out to Spaceballs.
I hadn't made that connection. Thank you for informing us. I wasn't thinking of Mel Brooks and caregiving as being in the same sentence, but now I get it.
It's the way I walk through life.
That's all right. So our version of this is, as we say, we will be with a caregiver and we'll say, well, let's talk about the F word, and they'll kind of look at us like they're, and then we'll say, F stands for fun. Like, what do you do for fun? And so people, so you kind of take them, you said like they're a little bit taken aback already, but
Yeah,
oftentimes when they hear about fun, fun is like the furthest thing from their minds. They haven't had fun in years. They don't even remember
right.
what's fun for them anymore. And then we
Yeah.
have to have a conversation about what used to be fun for you, and maybe, oh yes, back in high school I did this, right? But it really brings home the point that some of the joy in life has been leached away. It's just not part of their daily existence anymore, and it's awfully tough to not have fun and not have joy in what we do every day. It's the fun, the good stuff is what keeps us going through the bad stuff.
Yes.
And that's what makes the caregiving most meaningful. It's not toileting somebody, even though it's important. It's the connection, it's the relationship, it's feeling, the love between you, or at least the care. And if you're not enjoying it or enjoying anything, then it's very hard to feel that.
Right. Yeah. I remember my mom lost her ability to speak for a number of years prior to her passing. And my dad was her primary caregiver, and she was at home the entire time. He took care of her for the duration. And it got to a point where he would say, if I can make her smile once a day, I'm good. Like that was a good day. Like make eye contact with me, and we're having just this knowing glance between one another, that's enough. And I've thought about that a lot over the years. It used to be, can I make her chuckle? Or, could we enjoy this, simple puzzle together or whatever. But of course, with dementia, as it goes on, the activities change. And that's true, I think, for a lot of long duration illnesses. Um, but it's also a matter of managing expectations and what's possible.
Yeah, I think we're all making the same point here that there has to be uh, some some chuckle, some smile, some connection that you're feeling with the care receiver. That it's not simply about checking tasks off of to-do list. That you
Mhm.
completed this task, completed that task. There has to be some sort of affection, some sort of understanding and that requires that we get out of our work mode at times and just kind of sit with somebody and be with them and not be so much doing for them, which is awfully tough. I think one of the ways that caregivers cope and keeping their own emotions at bay is by getting into this very task oriented way of living. They just kind of put themselves on the conveyor belt. I got to do this now. I got to do that now. I got to do this now,
Yeah.
without really stopping and thinking or feeling what it's like to be with this person. And
Mm.
unfortunately, people who are on the receiving end of care like that often feel like a burden. They feel like they're just a source of chores. And it sounds like what your dad had with your mom was very different. That he was doing things for her, but he was trying to be with her, and that it made a difference. And it probably was a good example for you and your sister to also be with her and not simply come over and do things for her.
It absolutely was. And as we're talking, I'm thinking about the different scenarios. So it was easier for my dad to do that because they were retired. So there wasn't a career, there weren't kids in the house. Um, but it was a good example for my sister and I, like you said, who did have both of us small children at the time and careers. And so when we would be over there, it would be like, okay, all that other stuff, it's going to have to stay over here because this is our time with her. And yeah, we might be feeding her or doing other things that it's like, if I think about it too long, it's going to bum me out that she can't do these things for herself. But instead, I can tell her what the kids are learning, what they're doing at school, what the new favorite toys and colors are, and things like that. So even when she couldn't respond, she knew we were having a conversation and it was meaningful time together.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes that hard for people is grief, that they don't want to express to their loved one who's still sitting there, even though,
Yep.
of course, already grief, especially if they have dementia or any sort of long illness in which they become diminished. You're grieving them while you're caring for them. So I think one way that many caregivers try to cope is to become that automaton, 2 o'clock we have this, 3 o'clock we have that. And unfortunately, like Barry said, it takes away from it makes the care receiver feel bad, like a burden, but
Yeah.
it also negates some connection because the connection has grief in it. Not that you want to cry to somebody who has, dementia or ALS or something like that, but you do want to be present. So there
Yeah.
are lots of ways. So in your family, which I think is terrific because I love humor too, Katie, is you use humor. And that keeps you to some extent emotionally present because humor has a lot of emotion in it, way better than crying, way better.
Yeah.
So I think, our advice to caregivers is they need to find ways to be emotionally present. If they don't, they really risk being on the road to burnout, which is
Mhm.
not a good thing because you want to be a caregiver as long as you have to be and you want to do it well.
Yeah. And okay, so I wasn't going to ask this question, then I realized you're both clinical psychologists, so you're fully qualified to answer it. um, what is the difference between depression and burnout? How can people tell a difference, or either way, are there certain things they're feeling that it's like, ooh, these are alarm bells. I should reach out to somebody for some help.
So I'll give you the technical differences. Let's start with burnout. What is burnout? It's usually when people have been working the same job for a long time. They feel physically exhausted. They feel mentally exhausted. They wake up with a sense of dread every morning. It's like, oh no. It's like years ago, there was an old Dunkin' Donuts commercial with the donut maker would wake up and
Time to
say,
make the donuts.
time to make the donuts. And I think
Yeah.
about the burnt out caregiver saying like time to make the donuts, time to get breakfast going and get them out of bed and get their clothes on and
Yeah.
it's another day of as I said before, unpleasant tasks to complete. And it's very hard to get yourself motivated after a while. That's burnout.
Mhm.
The word depression we use in culture all the time. Just common culture is people saying I feel depressed today. But the way Julie and I think about depression is as a clinical diagnosis, which has specific criteria defined by something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual put out by the American Psychiatric Association. So a diagnosis of depression has 9 criteria, includes things like depressed mood and inability to have joy, have fun, which is I think that aligns pretty closely with burnout. But it also has other symptoms. People with depression very commonly have appetite disturbance. They either eat too little or too much. They have sleep disturbance, sleeping too much or too little. They may have lots of thoughts about dying. They have very poor concentration. So what I would say is that there are aspects of burnout which overlap with the clinical symptoms of the diagnosis of depression, but a clinical diagnosis of depression is a more severe condition. It has both mental symptoms and very specific physical symptoms, and it's debilitating. People who are burnt out sometimes just keep pushing themselves through. People who are depressed don't push themselves through very well. They don't function well, and those are the folks. But burnout may be a way station on the way to clinical depression, but it's not all the way at clinical depression, in my opinion. Julie, what are your thoughts?
I would add that a lot of people burning out um, feel anxiety. They feel a sort of overwhelming, like dread, like Barry said, but even just, I don't know if I can keep doing this. I'm overwhelmed all the time. I don't know how to relax. Even if I leave my care receiver and I go sit somewhere for an hour, my mind is just going and I feel like I'm not keeping up. And so there's,
Yeah.
you know, diagnoses are just collections of symptoms in my book. I mean, they're important for research purposes and for understanding people, but um, they definitely overlap. Depression overlaps with burnout, anxiety overlaps with burnout, but burnout occurs as an outcome of not doing enough self-care while caregiving in this example. It could be at
Mhm.
work too, but it has to do with not doing enough self-care. And if it's at work, it often has to do with your work not lining up with your kind of moral grounding. Like you're forced to do work that you don't believe in or that you think is wrong or whatever. But in caregiving, it's often not doing things to get a break, not taking a break, losing friendships, not having any social life anymore, no one to turn to, grinding away every day at the tasks. Um, that's the thing that we worry about for caregivers because the goal is to complete the mission, to do the caregiving from start to finish as well as possible. So if somebody is starting to burn out, we want to help them get back on track. And,
Yeah.
that often requires them to do something different. And that's really hard for caregivers. They feel like I'm doing it my way, I'm doing it the right way. I'll do it till, I don't know what, I fall over, which happens. So
Yeah.
when we're talking to caregivers with burnout, we're trying to get them to agree to take a little step back, bring in someone else to spot you, put your loved one in respite for a day or two, do something to get your breath back, to just feel like, who you are, because you can caregive till you forget.
Yeah.
And and get present again because that's important. So, in our, as I'm sure in your world, it's like this is the world of caregiving. Burnout is a huge risk.
Yes. Yeah. And it's one of the challenges, as you stated, you're in your schedule and you have your things to do. And then someone is saying you need to practice self-care. And now you're looking at your schedule and going, well, that means I have to move this. And they don't like this at that time. And that can create anxiety and additional stressors. So it's folks have to figure out ways to work things in so that it is part of the schedule where you have 20 minutes to take a walk outside or whatever, small things to do.
Yeah, what I would say, Katie, is, I mean, there's a kind of step. There's a practical matter of how to fit in, shoehorn in some self-care into a busy schedule, and I think that's true for caregivers as well as it's true for p parents of young children, as well as true for emergency room physicians and lots of other folks who have very stressful jobs. Um, there's another question though that comes before that, which is, do I feel entitled to caring for myself? Do I feel, is it going to make me feel guilty if I'm devoting time for myself? Because people have this idea that somehow this is a zero-sum game, and we write about this a lot in the AARP Caregiver Answer Book, that care that I provide for myself is care that I'm taking away from the care receiver.
Hmm.
And because it's almost like there's a finite amount of energy that could be provided for care. And the point that
Hmm.
we always try to make is that when caregivers take time for themselves, and it could be that 20-minute walk, it could be taking listening to music through your earbuds while your care receiver is sitting watching television. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to sort of be there, but also taking time for yourself at the same time. Um, when people do that, it doesn't subtract the total amount of care that's available. It actually increases it because then they're more productive. They are they're a better caregiver because they're refreshed. So taking self-care equals better caregiving, more caregiving, not less caregiving. But that's not the way people initially approach this. And so again, they see this as, they're subtracting from what they can do, not adding to what they can do.
Right. Yeah. And that's an important distinction. Um, what's that tired phrase? You can't pour from an empty cup. It's true. So if there are small things you can do throughout the day to make sure, even if you can't fill it up all the way, just add drops here and there, it does add up over time. Um, so one of the things you write about in your book that I was really looking forward to talking about is this notion of moving a family member and bringing them closer to where you are. Um, there are certainly circumstances where people will move closer to their loved one, but it's a whole other ball game to move someone else to you. And you address it in the book. And I know you have personal experience with that. So um, feel free to share as much of that story as you'd like, but certainly maybe some best practices or things to think about if that's something that is coming down the pike.
Jill, I have ideas, but do you want to start?
Well, maybe you want to start with what you actually did.
Okay, yeah, all right. So as I mentioned in 2010, Julie and I moved my mother and stepfather up from Florida to live in an apartment a mile from our home in suburban Philadelphia. Um, that sounds easy. It was really hard, right? Because they had been down there living in their community for about 15 years. They had a ton of friends. They had a whole lifestyle. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know anybody in the town where we live. So we were really extracting them from their community, from their whole life, and plopping them down in a different state where they'd never lived before. And that's not even taking into account all the labor it took to take all the possessions that they collected and winning them down to a smaller number and having them have to sacrifice all kinds of things that they really cherished. I mean, all that was hard, but just to focus on the shifting in the community piece. I mean, they were here and they knew no one other than us, and they were already feeling embarrassed about being so dependent on us for helping them with tasks, and now they're also dependent on us for kind of social stimulation. So it took a while for my stepfather wasn't really able to make connections with other people because his dementia was already too advanced at that point. But it took him a while for my mother to begin to form a little group of friends, to have a little bit of a social routine that didn't involve us. So all of that was hard. I mean, we tried to support them with tasks, but we couldn't go out and make friends for them. They had to do that on their own. So
Yeah.
they lived in an apartment building very close to us, which is what in the business is called a NORC, a naturally occurring retirement community. So it's not a retirement community in the technical sense of the term, but it happens to be a place where a lot of old people happen to live. And so
Yeah.
my mother was in very good company, and the apartment building had a van that would take people to the mall and take them to the supermarket. So they didn't necessarily need a car. And on the van, everybody would chit chat and they would go out to lunch. And so it became a way for my mother to develop that social milieu for herself. It took time. It took time. It was hard. Um, because she had a husband who had dementia, she wasn't inviting people over to her apartment to have tea with her because a lot of the folks that she met, even if they understood dementia a little bit, they didn't necessarily want to come and spend time with someone who was really impaired. And my stepfather was really impaired. So there was always this risk that my mother would become isolated. So I don't know if I've given you best practices so much as some of the challenges that exist.
Yeah.
I would basically say that this is something that if you're going to do this, caregivers got to understand that it's not simply moving someone from one environment to the other by getting, hiring a moving van. It just entails all these other pieces of them to help them develop something of a life. Because without
Yeah,
that, they're going to just be all the more dependent on you.
And they're
absolutely.
also going to be grieving all the things they lost from the place they came from to where they are now. And oftentimes, when you move a family member or parents, it's not because they're eager. I mean, it would be great if they were eager. I mean, we had two teenage kids. They could have been really happy to live near them, but they had their life in Florida, so they were not eager. Um, and usually people are not. They don't want their life taken away from them. It's really a big loss. So I think you have to be sensitive to what they're going through and that they might not appreciate what you've done for them. I mean, we got them this lovely apartment in this adorable town and they didn't love it. They were not happy with it. Um,
We didn't have
Complete.
a golf course right outside their window, is like where they lived before, but I mean, it wasn't bad actually.
No, it's a lovely place. It still is, but he couldn't play golf anyway. But I remember Barry's mom complaining to her nieces that, it wasn't nice, but I'm telling you, it was lovely. So she was
Yeah,
just having such a hard time with the transition. So in terms of best practices, keep in mind that the people that you're moving, even if they want to, it's still filled with loss. And then
yeah,
it's just like when you put somebody into a skilled nursing facility, ultimately, which we had to do down the road with each of Barry's, mom and stepdad.
hmm,
Um, there's that grief too. There's loss and there's fear. This is the last place I'm ever going to be. So I think it's important to stay sensitive to what they're experiencing because a lot of times it comes across as anger and criticism when it's really tremendous sadness.
yeah, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. My dad downsized after my mom passed. And so we said goodbye to our family home. We were not one of those families that moved around a good bit or even once. Like that was my house for 40 plus years. And so there are also people on that spectrum who are saying goodbye to family homes, but they're being moved closer to, where a child or someone who's going to take care of them live. So the caregiver is also then experiencing some of that loss. And in that way, I think it's a little easier to understand maybe how the parent is feeling because you have that loss too. Um, but you're also not the one losing your autonomy. And that's a different ballgame.
Yes, it's really hard. So, we tried with Barry's mom and stepfather to take them out, to take them to dinner, to go on some walks, they went to a dinner party with us. I don't know if you remember that, Barry. We tried to kind of get them a little bit integrated. They didn't really want our help so much. And Barry's mom did really well after her husband was in a facility because he really had gotten so bad. Um,
Yeah,
she was able to sort of expand her horizons a little bit because she wasn't home taking care of him all the time.
right. Well, and it is hard when dementia is in the picture because it makes so many people uncomfortable. My parents lived in the same place forever, and there were plenty of people who had known them a very long time who, once dementia was mentioned, didn't see them anymore. So I can imagine and empathize that being in a new environment and trying to make connections would be very difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always very upsetting to hear stories like that, Katie, about the kind of prejudice, discrimination that people have towards others with dementia. And it's all fear. I mean, we all understand it's fear, and yet it's still not excusable. I mean, they shouldn't disappear, especially folks that you've known for decades. They don't become contagious that you have to now avoid them. And so it's always hard to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. It always says more about the other person I think. It took me a little while to learn that, and kind of move past that. But now on the other side of all of that, it's very clear that some people, for one reason or another, just don't have the capacity um, to deal with it.
I mean, I think you're being kind to them. I'm probably a little harsher with them. Yeah, they don't have the capacity, and shame on them, right? They should find it within themselves to stretch themselves a little bit, get out of their comfort zone, and deal with people who have problems that may be unfamiliar to them, even if that's a frightening prospect to them. They ought to be able to do it just out of kindness.
Yep,
And
very
so,
Yeah,
good. Check on your dad, bring him a dinner, like do something as a neighbor or a longstanding friend, even if they couldn't really deal with your mom that much.
yeah, yeah. And that was one of the jokes that my sister and I used to have. She was in her late 20s. I was in my early 30s when all of this started. And we're like, well, if we can put on our big kid pants,
Right.
it would be nice if others could follow suit. And there were plenty who did. Um, but it is striking when you're going through this experience who shows up and who doesn't.
It's
yeah,
true.
it's often surprising who shows up and who doesn't. And people you had relied on don't show up. It hurts like heck. And then it's like a miracle when people who sort of acquaintances suddenly play a more prominent role in your life, and they become
Yeah,
lifelong friends with you afterwards.
right. Yeah. And it's often folks who have been through it and they understand what you're dealing with. At least that's what I'm learning.
It's such a good point. I mean, we talked about caregiving, we wrote about caregiving, but not until we lived it
Hmm.
did we really understand what it feels like, what you go through, what the stress is like, what the constant being on call feels like. You can read a ton of books, but until you live it, it's sort of like when you lose a parent, like people who have not lost their parent yet, they don't know what it's like to go through that feeling. So,
Right.
and it sounds like you and your sister were so young going through your mom's process of dementia. No, you probably didn't know anyone who had been through anything like that.
No, not dementia and not their parent. We had friends who had, grandparents going through it. We'd gone through it with our own grandma. My dad's mother had it. Um, but yeah, I think one of the reasons we leaned on each other so much is because neither one of us knew anyone who was dealing with what we were dealing with. We had kids who were not in school yet and dealing with, dementia that had started in my mom's 60s.
Yeah, it's lonely to not have people understand, and you don't want to keep explaining it, and people don't want to keep hearing about it, which is sad.
Right. Yeah. I remember I was talking with someone and I will not out them. But they stopped me and they said, I really can't talk about dementia. It is the thing that scares me the most. I'm sorry your family's dealing with this, but I don't want to hear any more about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, oh, okay. I'm a pretty open person, so sometimes I overshare, but you know,
It's awful. I
there's
mean,
all kinds of
it's fearfulness, but that does not make it okay. Get it, like you said, just get over it, deal with reality.
yeah.
It's hard.
Well, on that note, um, is there anything else you would like to share with the audience, either specifically about the AARP Caregiver Answer Book or just in general, words of wisdom about caregiving? Julie, you can go first, and then Barry can wrap up.
Sure. I'll just quickly say about the AARP Caregiver Answer Book. We wrote it to be a roadmap for caregivers. So we tried to answer every single question we have heard over the many decades that we have been in this field, so that as a caregiver, in particular, a new caregiver, you can open the book and find answers to pretty much everything that you might have as a question. From emotional related stuff with siblings or parents to, like I said before, making sure there's nothing in the way so the person doesn't trip. and financial stuff, talking to doctors, you name it. I mean, we've tried to cover everything, and we're waiting for someone to ask us something that is not in there because we really try.
You're going to
Um,
be hard pressed to find it because it's very comprehensive. I've strongly recommended and actually purchased a couple copies for folks that I know. It's really well done.
Thank you, Katie. That's high praise. We really appreciate hearing that. Um, and so the book is that roadmap, particularly to help early caregivers get the lay of the land
Mhm.
to so that they don't feel so lost at the beginning. But the other
Right.
piece of this that we weave in throughout the book and we talk about with our psychotherapy clients all the time is this is hard. And people, as you pointed out earlier, Katie, people have to give themselves grace. People
Mhm.
are going to make mistakes. They don't have to beat themselves up for those mistakes. And if they choose to beat themselves up for making those mistakes, it doesn't make them a better caregiver. It only makes them black and blue, is what we say. And
Yeah.
I mean, and so we do really need to do the best that we can, knowing that with time and more experience and more knowledge, we'll get better at this. And there are people who get really, really good at being caregivers. And
Yes.
then, then the sad part is that their care receiver one day dies and they miss them, but they also miss what has become a really meaningful role for them. And then we've also, the other thing we talk about in the book is what does a post caregiving life look like that's meaningful, and that
Yes.
we've seen people who then go on and take on some other caregiving role, whether it be caring for other family members or becoming a hospice volunteer or starting a caregiver podcast or becoming a caregiver coach or do something like that.
Right. Yeah. And thank you for touching on that. It is vital to have a plan for when the caregiving journey ends, whether your person gets better or unfortunately if they pass. Either way, life looks different after caregiving. And it is certainly worth your time to give what that looks like some thought.
Yeah, that's actually one of the most common questions. And when we do presentations on caregiving, we often will share this. People say, when can I get back to my life? This isn't my life. I want to get back to what I did before, who I was before. And as you just pointed out, caregiving changes us. We are
Yeah.
not the same, and the things that we may have felt were important to us before may not seem so important now. And
Mhm.
people don't just return to what they did before. They have to reinvent themselves because of with the knowledge that they've gained and experiences that they've had, and they need to make new meanings in their life. And most former caregivers do.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. And for those of you who are listening at home or in the car or wherever you happen to be today, we will provide a link for this book in the show notes, as well as you can find it on our website, thecarefulist.com. And until next time, take care.